Along with the government shutdown, here's the House of Representatives.
Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., October 3, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Greg Harper to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House on January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the floor of this House has been the scene of many heated exchanges of late, the shutdown controversy around the Affordable Care Act, budget differences. But in the midst of some real tension and frustration, there was a bright spot last evening. I was pleased that there was a unanimous consent agreement to approve H.R. 3233 that I introduced with Representative Adam Kinzinger that kept the Special Immigrant Visa Program alive for Iraqi nationals who helped the United States during the war effort at great peril to themselves and their families. These are the interpreters, the guides, drivers, people who performed a myriad of functions that were essential for American operations, both militarily, diplomatically, and for our development efforts. Since I introduced the first legislation on these refugees 6 years ago, I've watched impatiently as the flawed Special Immigrant Visa Program has sputtered, leaving Iraqis and Afghans twisting in the wind, trying to escape those countries away from people with long memories who seek to do them harm. Then, Monday night, it died. September 30th, the visa program for the Iraqis expired. After 72 hours of furious activity, last night, the United States sent a signal that we were not going to leave them behind. Last night, Congress came together, the House and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, to make it possible to uphold our end of the bargain. But unfortunately, the program still is horribly flawed, disastrously slow, and in dire need of reform. But we can take heart that the bipartisan leadership displayed on this issue might make it possible for us to actually make it work. I would thank my colleagues Adam Kinzinger, Tulsi Gabbard, Chris Gibson, Steve Stivers, Steny Hoyer, and others who stepped in during this tumultuous time to make sure the project continued. Despite what was going on behind the scene, there were many staff without whose tireless dedication to doing the right thing this would never happen. I would like to thank Robert Karim in Leader Cantor's office, Mariah Sixkiller in Steny Hoyer's office, Dimple Shah in Chairman Goodlatte's office, and Chad Kriegmeyer in Senator Shaheen's office. The senator helped spearhead that effort on the other side of the aisle. And off the Hill, there were veterans like Matt Zeller, who was not going to let the person who he depended on in Iraq suffer that fate. Organizations off the Hill, like the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Program and their staff, Katie Reisner and Becca Heller, were invaluable in keeping the progress going. It was kind that Chairman Goodlatte, the Judiciary Committee chair, introduced the unanimous consent request. There was lots of scrambling, many items, loose ends, but somehow we were able to follow through with this small but critical step to keep the program alive. Now, the challenge is to finally make it work for these desperate Iraqis and Afghans. Kirk Johnson's book, To be a friend is fatal. The Iraqis that America left behind is a call to action. It details what we need to do to meet our obligations. In the midst of all the controversy and frustration here on Capitol Hill, we were able to come together for a brief moment this evening. Let's not let the shutdown overshadow the myriad of details that are important, even life and death, for people at home and abroad. Those who risk their lives for the American mission in Iraq and Afghanistan deserves our best efforts. Last night we saw a glimpse of it. I hope we're able to follow through.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I am privileged to represent Redstone Arsenal, one of America's premier military bases and home to the Army Materiel Command, Aviation and Missile Command, Security Assistance Command, Contracting Command, Expeditionary Contracting Command, Space and Missile Defense Command, and numerous other program executive offices, agencies, and centers. According to the Department of Defense, quote, of the department's 800,000 civilian workers, about half will be furloughed, end quote. That means President Obama, our Commander-in-Chief, in his sole discretion, publicly declared that roughly 400,000 DoD civilian employees are not essential to America's national security. While I disagree and question why any Commander-in-Chief would, in his sole discretion, slight 400,000 defense workers by declaring them superfluous to America's national security, that is not why I address the House of Representatives today. What I want to know is, why do President Obama, Democrat Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and their allies pointlessly insist on shutting down the Department of Defense? Let me elaborate. On June 14, 2013, almost 4 months ago, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1960, the National Defense Authorization Act, on a 315 to 108 bipartisan vote. 103 House Democrats, a Democrat majority, joined 212 Republicans to pass the National Defense Authorization Act. On July 24, 2013, almost 3 months ago, the House passed H.R. 2397, the Defense Appropriations Bill, on a 315 to 109 bipartisan vote. 95 House Democrats joined 220 Republicans in passing the Defense Appropriations Bill. I publicly thank the House Democrats who supported the programs and funding that help America's warfighter protect American lives. Collectively, these bills restore funding lost because of sequestration and fully fund America's military and national defense. If these defense bills become law, then national defense is exempt from President Obama's shutdown orders. Unfortunately, there is an unhappy ending to the House's bipartisan support for national defense. Democrat Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid needlessly obstructs votes on both bills, thus causing them to languish 3 and 4 months in the United States Senate. Senate intransigence means the Department of Defense is subject to President Obama's shutdown orders, and 400,000 defense workers are, as of today, barred from helping our warfighters who risk their lives for America both here and abroad. Each day, these 400,000 defense workers do not work is another day America's warfighters are without their help, is another delay that denies our warfighters the cutting edge and high-tech weaponry needed to defeat America's enemies with a minimal loss of life. Mr. Speaker, Democrat Senator Harry Reid should stop his obstructionism and allow a vote, just a vote, on the defense bills that have passed the House of Representatives with bipartisan support. If he does, both bills will pass and become law, and national defense will be fully funded and exempt from President Obama's shutdown orders. Mr. Speaker, the Senate, White House, and Congress agree on close to 99% of our appropriation bills. The White House and Senate must stop using a federal government shutdown and the loss of 400,000 national defense jobs to coerce the House of Representatives into spending money America does not have on a socialized medicine program that does not work and that a majority of Americans do not want. The responsible thing to do is fund the 99% in the federal government shutdown and then debate and negotiate the 1% that we legitimately disagree on. Mr. Speaker, I urge Democrat Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid to join our bipartisan House effort to compromise, yes, compromise, and pass the National Defense Authorization Act, the Defense Appropriations Bill, thereby securing America's national security while at the same time restoring 400,000 jobs America's economy sorely needs. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Barrow, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's day number 3. Day number 3 of a government shutdown that doesn't need to happen. Mr. Speaker, we need leadership. We don't need the blame game. And yet, that's what we're seeing. Republicans blaming Democrats. Democrats blaming Republicans. You know, the House blaming the Senate blaming the House blaming the President. That isn't getting us anywhere. And to the American people, they're not saying, oh, it's the Democrats' fault or it's the Republicans' fault. They're looking at Congress and saying, why can't you do your job? Why can't you come together as Democrats and Republicans, bring your best ideas forward and compromise, negotiate? What this House is doing, what Congress is doing, is reckless. It's irresponsible. We need to start putting the American people's interests first because they're the ones that we work for. That's who sent us here. We're not asking anyone to give up their convictions. We all have our convictions and we all have our districts and the people back home. What we're asking for the members in this body, the Republicans and the Democrats, is to think about the country. Now's the time for us to put the American people first. That means we've got to be able to come forward and understand and learn how to listen. It's hurting real people. Let me actually, I'm a doctor by training, and I look at this from the perspective of being a doctor and the American patients. As reported in my hometown newspaper, the Sacramento Bee, at my hometown hospital, where I'm still a clinical professor, UC Davis Medical Center, here's what they said. For cancer patients, government help in the form of clinical trials sponsored by the National Cancer Institute can be a matter of life and death. And the NCI, a federal agency, has closed the doors for the duration. One of my colleagues, Dr. David Gandera at the UC Davis Cancer Center lung cancer specialist, said this: we have California patients from our center who have been going through clinical trials there and have been told to go home. The program has been shut down. Now, I know yesterday you brought a bill to the floor, a resolution that restored partial funding to the NIH for 6 months or 3 months through December. But as a doctor, cancer patients are not looking at 3 months. They need some certainty. We need some certainty in the practice of medicine when we're sitting with our patients. So I implore this body to come together as Democrats and Republicans to think about those patients, to think about those Americans who are being hurt by our inability to do our job. Now, I'm going to continue, as a Democrat, I'm going to continue talking to my Republican colleagues and looking at ways that we can move forward. But inflammatory rhetoric and the blame game is not going to get us anywhere. We've got to learn how to listen to one another. We've got to learn how to speak to one another, and we've got to learn how to put the American people ahead of political parties. That's who we work for. The oath I took as a doctor is born on a foundation of 2 solid principles: benevolence, to do good; non-malfeasance, to do no harm. Mr. Speaker, Congress's inability to get the job done is doing irreparable harm to Americans and to American patients, and we certainly are not doing any good by not getting a budget put together and getting America back on track. Let's do our job. Let's do what the American people sent us here to do. Let's work together as Republicans and Democrats and learn how to listen to one another again and do the work of the American public. Mr. Speaker, the public is watching. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mica, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and my colleagues. And it's pleased to hear the gentleman from California from the other side of the aisle who just spoke and his willingness to work together. I think that's the kind of cooperation that the American people are looking for and that Congress needs to adhere to in coming together and resolving this. No one wants a shutdown. No one wants to see vital and essential government programs eliminated or withheld from the public. Sometimes in these situations that are most difficult, you actually become concerned about basic common sense or, again, the attempts of certain people to try to embarrass each side. I think one of the worst things I've seen in my service was the close down of some of our memorials. This probably won't show up for my colleagues very well, but this is the Martin Luther King Memorial. You just walk up and look at it. But to deploy interior and park personnel to put out barriers to constrain the public from even walking is absolutely senseless, mindless, bureaucratic move. Many people saw also the construction, and this again is not a very good photo, but this is park personnel that were deployed putting fences up in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and then most offensively to put barriers to block in an open-air park memorial, our World War II Veterans Memorial. This is senseless. Now, I've talked to Mr. Issa and the Oversight Subcommittee and committees, both that I chair one. Mr. Issa chairs the whole Oversight Committee of Congress. I know Mr. Hastings is going to look into this, his Natural Resources Committee. But this is a senseless offense to the American people, and particularly our veterans and others. There's no reason for this. So some common sense has to prevail in all of this. We will get beyond this. People will be made whole. And it is unfortunate that sometimes government, whether it was back in Washington's days or throughout our history, does work on a brinkmanship basis and does not get a resolution, particularly when you come to difficult times. And my colleagues, we are at one of the most difficult times in history. Within the next 2 weeks, the United States of America will be at our debt limit. We'll be $17 trillion in debt. They're going to come and ask for another $1 trillion for a year to keep us from being a deadbeat nation. How did we get here? That's part of the question that has to be resolved here. You had an era of unprecedented spending, the 4 years in which the other side, and this is facts, took control. They spent $1.5 trillion more than they took in the first year in office, $1.4 trillion, $1.3 trillion, and so on and so on, until we've gone from $9 trillion in debt to 17, reaching 18, almost double in 5 or 6 years. That's unsustainable. So that's what this is about. It's also about a health care program. And I come from a family that at times didn't have health care, and many Americans need health care, and we should be able to provide them. But people didn't ask for a bureaucracy. People didn't ask for thousands of bureaucrats here to manage a government program. They didn't ask for IRS enforcers. They didn't ask for many of the mandates that are in this bill that can and need to be revised. The President has already revised the law. The President said he didn't need the Congress, as you'll recall, some time ago, and obviously he hasn't. He's changed some of the terms, given exemptions to employers, put that off for a year, which was part of the law. We've asked, and again, some of us wanted it repealed, some of us didn't like it, but We now have it. We need to revise it. And we need to make certain that Americans have good health care and access to affordable care, but not with the bureaucracy. We've offered at least 3 alternatives and some changes. The last one pretty simple, a delay for a while, the individual mandate like we've done for others. So we can do this, we must do this, and we must succeed for the American people. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're now on our 3rd day of the Republican shutdown of the federal government. My constituents and people all across this country are disgusted with what they're seeing. The absence of an agreement on a simple idea. The American people have a right to a government that is open to serve them. But our government's closed. 800,000 men and women across the country have been placed on furlough because Speaker Boehner and the House Republican leadership will not bring up a clean, continuing resolution to fund the government and keep the federal government open. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means for my constituents, and first to say that I've extended office hours in my district office from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. To be sure that my constituents have whatever help I can provide during this government shutdown to help navigate through the federal government, and that is being staffed by my employees who have no guarantee they'll even be paid. But I want to talk this morning about how we got here, not to assign blame to one side or the other, but to suggest how we move forward. Because we've heard from the Speaker this last few days and from many of the Republican leaders that they just want to compromise. If the Democrats would just be willing to compromise and go to a conference committee, this would all work out. And that the Republicans are interested in delaying health care reform and cutting spending, and that Democrats refuse to negotiate on these issues. Well, this is actually completely false. In fact, look at this chart. We began with spending in the President's budget of $1.2 trillion. You can see how far there has already been compromise from the Democrats, down from the enacted spending to the Ryan budget, to the Senate budget, and finally to the continuing resolution, which is very close to the Ryan budget. Not a budget amount that we agree with, but something we're willing to compromise on. And this is, in fact, a budget. There was a budget that was passed by the House, a budget passed by the Senate, and we passed no budget, no pay, which I was a co-sponsor of, to make sure this budget process proceeded. But the Speaker has refused, since that happened, to appoint conferees to a budget committee. That's the next step. That's how we get a budget. To appoint conferees who then have the responsibility of working out compromise. We wrote to the Speaker back in April 17th, there's a copy of the letter. The ranking member Chris Van Hollen and I wrote to the Speaker urging him to appoint conferees so we could continue the budget process. But he's refused to do that. And then just moments before the shutdown happened, Republicans said, oh, let's go to conference on the funding bill, the continuing resolution, not on the budget. That, of course, was a vote to shut down the government, because that wasn't going to happen in 45 minutes. And so the government shut down, and this is now day 3. You have to wonder, why is it that the Republicans have refused to pass a clean funding bill that we are calling for? Well, one member of the House Republican caucus said, and I quote, now that we've jumped off the cliff and lit ourselves on fire, we've entered the valley of the shadow of death, we've got to keep running and hold together, end quote. Mr. Speaker, our country is facing very serious challenges today. Men and women in cities and towns all across our country don't know where to find work, don't know if they're going to be able to go to work. Seniors are nervous about whether they can rely on Social Security and Medicare. Young people are worried about whether they can afford to go to college. These issues are far too important for Republicans to refuse to negotiate simply as a matter of pride. Every member of this House needs to put aside political posturing and act in the best interest of the people who sent us here. Rather than coming together to support common-sense solutions and policies that would strengthen our country, Speaker Boehner and the Republicans have decided to shut down the federal government until they're able to undermine the Affordable Care Act. For them, it's become an obsession. Earlier this week, one House Republican called the Affordable Care Act, and I quote, the most insidious law known to man, end quote. House Republicans compared this debate to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. And when he held the floor for 21 hours, Senator Ted Cruz invoked the horrors of World War II and the Nazi regime when talking about health care reform. Mr. Speaker, this kind of hyperbole, this kind of plainly inflammatory rhetoric has no place in a serious discussion about the future of our country. For weeks, we've heard that the Republicans would refuse to fund the government until it dismantled or defunded the Affordable Care Act. This became their party's mantra until 2 days ago. Because 2 days ago, the Republicans stopped trying to defund Obamacare for the first time and started to try to carve out programs to fund one by one. The very reason they brought this government to a screeching halt and closed it down was all of a sudden gone. So I asked my colleagues today, what's the problem now? What's the holdup on passing a clean funding bill to reopen government and then go to conference to work out all of the differences on many important policy issues? And so, Mr. Speaker, I ask my Republican colleagues, my friends on the other side of the aisle, to do what's right for our country and demand that the Speaker bring a funding bill to the floor to open government and pass this resolution today. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's day 3 of Senator Reid's government shutdown. The American people are frustrated. Western Pennsylvanians are frustrated. I am frustrated. Make no mistake, there is a choice here. The House's solution embraces fairness for all. The Senate's spending bill protects special deals for Washington, D.C. The House passed 4 reasonable compromises to keep the government open. Our latest solution ends the special deal that President Obama cut for senators and representatives. It also gives individuals and families the same break from the health care law that President Obama gave to big business. Senator Reid could reopen the government today. Unfortunately, he refuses to compromise. In fact, he said yesterday that he is locked in tight. Senator Reid is locked in tight on those special breaks for big business and senators and representatives. This is an outrage. Mr. Speaker, as I answer the phones in my office, I hear from constituents who tell me that there should be no special deals. There should be fairness for all. The American people deserve better from their senators. It is time for the Senate to end special deals, embrace fairness for all, and reopen this government. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes a gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is day 3 of a completely unnecessary government shutdown. About 800,000 people don't know if they'll have a paycheck at the end of the week. Basic government services are being denied, hundreds of millions of dollars wasted. Moms who count on WIC to feed their kids are being hurt. Head Start providers are closing. Families trying to buy a home are turned away. Small businesses needing loans are told to wait. This could all end in about 20 minutes if we could just vote on the compromise that already passed the Senate. Is it perfect? No. It funds the government at levels below the budget passed by Democrats in the Senate and proposed by Democrats in the House. It keeps in place the across-the-board cuts triggered by sequestration, which I didn't vote for and do not support. But I am willing to support this bill, this compromise, this so-called clean continuing resolution, because we are damaging the country by this shutdown and we need to reopen the government. And why is the government shut down? People don't understand this. Well, because some of my colleagues want to defund, delay, and deny the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, we took an oath here. When we were sworn into the office, we took an oath to support the Constitution. And according to the Constitution, when a bill passes both chambers and is signed into law by the President, it becomes a law. We learned that in basic civics. The Affordable Care Act is a duly passed, signed by the President, and upheld by the Supreme Court law. So if you don't like a law, how do you change it? Again, think back to civics. Through the legislative process. Draft legislation, have hearings, mark it up, put it up for a vote. That's how this body ought to function. How not to change laws? By shutting down the federal government. Who on earth could be proud of what we're doing here? Who could look at this and be proud? I'll tell you, the American people, in fact, people around the world are watching. They've seen bitterness and rancor. They've heard oversimplification and a lot of misinformation. It is time to stop governing by cynicism and crisis. It's time to realize that what is happening here is beneath the dignity of this chamber and this body. It's time to restore democracy. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, the American people do not deserve this shutdown. There are enough members of the Republican and Democratic caucuses to open this government right now. Mr. Speaker, let us vote. Let's pass the Senate amendment to the continuing resolution. Let's reopen the government of this United States of America, and let's do it now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about what real-world people in Texas District 17 are saying about Obamacare. Leonard from Waco writes, "Government is too big. No one knows how to lead. Government needs to get out of our lives. Repeal Obamacare. Whatever the cost, it will be less than the negative effect it will have here on this country and on all Americans." Lance and Tamara of Thorndale write, "We would like to express our disdain for the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Although we have health insurance that meets the standard of care, we also know that this health care program will adversely affect many young people who are just starting out in life and may not have adequate care that meets the standard. While we do not believe that taxpayers or health care providers should fund the bill for those who do not have health care, the ACA is clearly not the solution. Any program that federally mandates health care and involves punitive sanctions by way of the IRS on tax returns should be considered a crime. It will neither help the poor nor the wealthy that will suffer the negative impact of this plan, but rather the young, the working, and tax-paying family that earns just enough to survive. We believe that a bad plan is worse than no plan, and Congress should continue to oppose and repeal the ACA, even if it means the continuation of the government shutdown. We received a letter from President Obama in which he clearly blamed the U.S. House for the shutdown and where he accepted no responsibility. We cannot abide by this president and do not support him or his self-serving ideologies. John from College Station writes, "No to Obamacare." Mike from Hewitt writes, "Please hold the line against the Affordable Care Act. Do not give in." Barry from Pflugerville writes, "As you know, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was passed in the middle of the night and without the support of the American people. I am calling on you as one of your constituents to stop this legislation by defunding its implementation until the law can be repealed and replaced with legislation that benefits the citizens of the United States of America. You were elected in office to represent the values and needs of those of us who live in your state and your district. The passage of this legislation was an abdication of oath that the lawmakers took when sworn into office, and I hope that you will do the right thing now and stop the law from being fully implemented and will work to enact real reform for our health care system based on free market principles, not government interference. Americans enjoy the best health care system in the world, and this legislation harms the very people it is intended to help." Marilyn from College Station writes, "I urge you to stand firm and do all that you can to repeal, defund this law that is a disaster to employers, employees, and our health care system." Jack from Woodray writes, "Mr. Flores, please do all in your power to help fund the government, and please do not fund Obamacare. As seniors, we cannot afford the increased premiums for our insurance coverage." Tanya from Waco writes, "I am a small business owner in Waco. I built my business from nothing, and I see the horrible ramifications of Obamacare on small business. Please stand strong and fight to defund Obamacare." Deborah from Bryan writes, "The President's health care must be defunded before it destroys our economy, our workforce, and our health care system and our way of life. My insurance will increase 42% in 2014, and who knows where it goes from there. As a citizen of the United States, I do not want my tax dollars to fund a train wreck. We simply cannot afford it. Please convince your fellow representatives they are destroying the working class. There is no way this is good for all of us. A young man from Brazos County writes, my current premium for a family plan with a $5,000 deductible costs $360 per month. This was canceled due to Obamacare. When trying to apply for Obamacare, he got two new quotes. The first was one with a $12,700 deductible and cost $691 a month. When he tried to find a lower deductible, he found an option with a $4,500 deductible and a cost of $854 per month. Again, essentially the same coverage for almost 2.5 times what he was paying before. Mr. Speaker, since September the 20th, the House has approved on a bipartisan basis 8 bills to fund all or part of the federal government. But all but one of these have been blocked by Harry Reid in the Senate. Mr. Speaker, during this process, my colleagues and I have been called arsonist, anarchist, extremist, extortionist, and terrorist. In addition, we've been told that we have bombs strapped to our chest. When I was growing up, I was taught that if you were calling people names, then that meant you had nothing meaningful to say. This fight is about fairness, Mr. Speaker. First, the Americans believe that if a delay for business that gave them $14 billion worth of benefit was good enough for business, it ought to be good for everybody by delaying the individual mandate for a year. Secondly, if Obamacare is good enough for the American people, it is good enough for the President, the Vice President, and all members of Congress. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all Americans pray for our country during these difficult times, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing here in Congress may not be unconstitutional, but it is unconscionable. It is unconscionable for us to have a wholesale shutdown of the government and a piecemeal startup. It is unconscionable to pit needy Americans against needy Americans. It's unconscionable. It may be lawful to single out some and say, you are among the fortunate that we were blessed today, but it's unconscionable. It's wrong. It may be lawful, but it's not right. It is wrong to decide that persons who happen to be poor, who need WIC, who need the very sustenance that people acquire to exist, food, clothing, and shelter. It's wrong to say you are not blessed today. Your time will come, but not today. It may be constitutional, but it's unconscionable. It is unconscionable for us in the richest country in the world to conclude that a mother who has a child making $15,080 a year, working full-time and living below the poverty line. It's unconscionable for us to push a system that will cause her to work full-time and not have insurance. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, by any name you call it, will allow that mother to get insurance for herself and her child. It may not be unconstitutional to adhere to a principle that would cause a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It is unconscionable, however, to do so in such a way as to prevent this mother from having insurance for her child. I came to Congress to represent everybody, and this includes those who make $7.25 an hour. I came to Congress to represent those who wait tables and make $2.13 an hour plus tips. It's unconscionable to have people working at $2.13 an hour in the richest country in the world cannot get health insurance. That's what the Affordable Care Act does. It allows them to get health insurance. And I must remind us all today, my dear friends, whom I love. I love every person who sits on that side of the aisle. I love every one of them. But I want to tell you this. Mark my word, Dr. King was right. Life is an inescapable network of mutuality. It's tied to a single garment of destiny. What impacts one directly impacts all indirectly. And while you can sit at home in comfort, assuming that it does not impact you, I assure you, the way the arc of the moral universe has been developed, it will impact you sooner or later. You're not worried about Wall Street right now, but when Wall Street takes a hit, it's going to eventually trickle down to every one of us. Worry about Home Street. I do. Worry about Main Street. That's okay. But I'm not going to put Wall Street above Home Street, where people live. And it's time for us to quit pushing a piecemeal startup for a wholesale shutdown. This is the richest country in the world. We shouldn't carry on like this. It's time for us to move forward and end the shutdown. Let's have free and fair and open negotiations. Let's not do it with the threat of the demise of the government at stake. Let's do it with everybody's intent in mind. Let's not pick and choose. Let's not say one is blessed today and another will be blessed tomorrow. Let's share the blessings of this nation with all of the people that we represent. And finally, Dr. King reminded us that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I say to my veteran friends whom I support, you should not feel good knowing that somebody has decided to bless you at the expense of somebody else. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Alabama, Mrs. Roby, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to express my frustration and the frustration of my constituents over the stalemate here in Washington. It didn't have to come to this. The House has put forth 4 proposals to the Senate, each one offering a compromise to the other side. Time after time, Senator Reid stonewalled our efforts to forge a compromise and to prevent a shutdown. When House Republicans passed legislation that simply asked Senate Democrats to just simply come to the table to negotiate, Senator Reid said no. Everyone knows that Republicans and Democrats don't see eye to eye on every spending issue. However, there is a lot that we do agree on, like funding critical care for cancer research, the national parks, veteran services, National Guardsmen, and reservists. And when we have drafted standalone bills funding these efforts, we saw support from some Senate Democrats. But again, Mr. Reid said no. So first, we couldn't get Mr. Reid to negotiate over what we disagree on, and today we can't get him to even consider that what we do agree on. Mr. Speaker, I don't know how many more olive branches we have left on the tree, but today we are going to offer more. We've already worked to ensure that young boys and girls who need cancer treatments from the National Institute of Health receive the life-saving medicine they deserve. Today, we will work to protect our nation's military men and women who have served so honorably in combat, only to have their hard-earned benefits denied to them by partisan bickering. Finally, and most importantly, we will work to end this shutdown, not just for some Americans, but for all Americans. Because, Mr. Speaker, this has always been an issue of fairness. So our message to President Obama is you are willing to sit down with big business and insurance companies to negotiate delays and exemptions and exceptions from the health care law. Why will you now refuse to negotiate with us and give us the same reprieve to regular Americans? Our message to the Majority Leader Reid is you work swiftly to pass a standalone funding bill for active duty soldiers. Why now not work with us to pass similar bills for veterans, our National Guardsmen and reservists, cancer research, or national parks? The people deserve better. Mr. Speaker, than President Obama and Majority Leader Reid's refusal to work toward bipartisan compromise. Enough is enough. Pass these non-controversial spending bills. Come to the negotiating table. Let's talk. Let's demonstrate fairness to the American people. Let's work together, and let's end this shutdown. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The word of the day is squander, defined broadly as the majority party having the votes to pass solutions that fit what America needs and wants, but instead moves forward with an approach to appease an angry faction of their party, and in doing so advances nothing but its own political short-sightedness while making a mockery out of public policy. Squander. In the House, we have had political theater of a piecemeal approach, where parks and cures for life-threatening diseases are used as rhetorical props. But this approach has done nothing to address the real danger to our national security and how this shutdown hinders our ability to keep Americans safe from terrorists. The government shutdown has furloughed 70% of the intelligence community, 70% of the civilians in the intelligence community. The director of the National Intelligence called the government shutdown a, quote, dreamland, unquote, for enemies that want to steal our nation's secrets, and said it, quote, seriously damages our ability to protect the security and safety of this nation and its citizens. And with each passing day, he thinks the damage becomes more insidious. Well, here we are, talking about parks, talking about our venerable veterans. We haven't said a word, really, about our intelligence community. We have basically, and I say this to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you have put out the welcome mat for every terrorist around this world to know that right now we are vulnerable. Maybe it was a clever concept behind closed doors several weeks ago. Delay the individual mandate of the Affordable Health Care Act for 1 year and trade for the House GOP approval of a government funding bill. Ignore the fact that the Affordable Care Act is law and that attempts to repeal it over 50 times have failed. Ignore the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled it is constitutional. Ignore the fact that 72% of the American people do not want to have the government shut down over the Affordable Care Act. Ignore John McCain, who said, Obamacare will not be repealed, and it is irrational to think so. Ignore the fact that on the same day that my friends on the other side of the aisle were patting themselves on the back for shutting down the government, the health care marketplaces around this country were overloaded. More than 10 million people were on that website and calling that telephone number because they want health insurance. My friends, to ignore is to be ignorant in this case, but take note. The real pain has started with the shuttering of many government services, the furloughing of 800,000 workers, and the real threat that people who depend on partial government assistance will get nothing. My colleagues, we are squandering this moment to lead. Those on the other side of the aisle that are the majority are squandering their majority and replacing their principled views of government with fruitless extremist objectives. Mr. Speaker, the last time I looked, Senator Cruz was not a member of the House of Representatives, but somehow it appears that he is running the show over here. The shutdown is keeping people from seeing their families. In San Francisco, Dave Donahue planned to take his wife and his 11-day-old child to meet the grandmother in Mexico. Baby Milo doesn't have a passport, and the passport office is closed. So they're going to have to forego that trip. Danny Aiello, a retired beat cop from Philadelphia, brought to Washington, D.C. by his daughter and son-in-law because he had just lost his wife of cancer, was here to see the Washington monuments, except now he's seeing them all from the outside, never going to go in to see the Air and Space Museum. What do we tell Victoria Thomas, 26, who has a 4-year-old daughter who cannot find child care now because there have been 9 Head Start programs that have been closed? I can't afford child care with my limited resources, she said, as a single mom who's studying for a master's degree in business, and she worries that her daughter will fall behind. She's learning so much, she says. The program is preparing her for kindergarten next year. Mr. Speaker, the word is squander, and it's time for us to reopen the government.
Expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Winstrup, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard much debate over the last week, arguments and accusations being made from both sides. I've heard references to being terrorists, to jihad, and to having bombs strapped to our chests. Mr. Speaker, I spent 1 year, 2005-2006, perhaps the bloodiest time of the war, as an Army combat surgeon in Iraq. In this chamber, I've seen no terrorists, no jihad, nor any bombs strapped to chests. And if you've been to war, you would not use such rhetoric here. Mr. Speaker, colleagues, we've engaged in so much debate concerning the Affordable Care Act. We've addressed it from every angle, the affordability, the methods of implementation, those that may benefit and those that will not. I've contended that as a nation, we should have focused on who's uncared for in our nation and how we provide care. Addressing the uninsured would certainly fall under this framework. And I've contended that a form, a mere piece of paper that says you have insurance or a plan does not mean that you have access to care, nor does it mean that you have coverage for treatment. Many from one side of the aisle have said, you lost the election, get over it. Indeed, the Republicans lost the presidential election, and I'm over it. However, all of us in this body won elections. Each of us was elected to serve the American people as well. And while the president has a seat at the head of the table, he does not have the only seat at the table. And we all need to take our seats at the table. I look forward, not backward, except to learn from history. I'm over the presidential election. What I'm not over is what we are becoming. What we are becoming is of great concern to me, as much concern to me as the Affordable Care Act itself. I have a concern about who we are and what we consider to be right and what we think is wrong. And I hope that everyone has taken the opportunity to look at our past. Our glorious history is all around us. As you look around and you review our great history, you see the legacies left from previous generations. What is our legacy? What will this generation, this Congress, leave behind? Will it be that we have a disregard for the law, a disregard for laws that we voted on and signed? Waivers, exemptions, special subsidies, all of which show a disregard for applying laws equally, as well as a disregard for the rule of law. Applying laws equally, the rule of law. The very ideals that Americans have proudly touted for over 2 centuries. Are we deciding to abandon these core values? Is this the way we want to carve out our chapter in American history? The history of a great nation, a nation that was formed to be of the people, by the people, and for the people. This concept and the freedom that comes with it requires a level of responsibility in order to sustain it. Pope John Paul II, when visiting America in 1995, spoke of the freedom that we enjoy and the responsibility that comes with it, and he summed it up by saying, freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. I pray that the rule of law and equality for all Americans are fundamental principles that are etched in all of our hearts. With the foundation of these principles and the civility that accompanies such, we are obligated to come together, to find common ground, and to talk to one another. and, Lord willing, we will. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the run-up to the government shutdown and now into day 3, I've sensed a gamut of emotions coursing through the veins of this institution, including emotional fatigue and frustration and outrage. You can tell there's outrage because of the elevated decibel level. And for some of us as well is the emotion of sadness. I don't know how you can help but feel otherwise if you keep in mind what the consequences of our inaction are having beyond the doors of this chamber. They're affecting real people, and they're having real consequences. I have the unbelievable privilege to represent Joint Base Lewis-McChord in Washington State and the tens of thousands of service members and civilian employees who support them there. The civilian employees already experienced furlough days. Just a few weeks ago, I spoke to one of those individuals. As a consequence of the furlough, she lost her car. I'm not sure what the consequence of government shutdown will be on her life. You know, we tend to think of those people, I suspect here, often as what we would call GS-10s or 12s or 14s, but that's not the case. The preponderance of them are GS-2s and 3s and 4s. And a protracted shutdown will materially alter their lives. Real people. Real consequences. Yesterday we received an email from a woman who is the WIC, Women, Infant, Children provider in our area. She has already had 16 phone calls from moms who are scared they're not going to be able to feed their children. Women, infants, children. Real people, real consequences. And as well, the wheels of commerce are grinding. We've been in contact with a commercial real estate person who is helping another person start up a propane distribution business in one of the communities in my district. He has one step left to go. That's a successful SBA application, which appears likely, except for he needs one more data point to submit, one more, from the Internal Revenue Service, which is not available to him now. He cannot submit. He cannot start his business. He cannot grow the economy. Real people. Real consequences. So, I'm sad. I'm sad because I know this does not have to be. I know, Mr. Speaker, that sitting up on that desk is a bill passed by the Senate last Friday, a clean, comprehensive bill which would reopen the federal government. And you know what else I know? And every single member of this chamber knows as well? It has the votes to pass. If we would but bring it up for a vote. And then, Mr. Speaker, we could reopen the federal government and we could take into account the real people and the real consequences of our inaction. We could put out the open for business sign in the federal government and help those that we were sent here to help. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all remember hearing the promise, if you like your health care, you can keep it. We also remember hearing that Obamacare would reduce insurance costs for families by about $2,500 a year. That's not what we're hearing now. Ronald, one of my constituents from Advance, North Carolina, just received a letter from Blue Cross Blue Shield informing him that because of Obamacare, his monthly premiums are tripling from $400 per month to $1,200 per month. His deductible also skyrocketed to $11,000. William in rural Hall, North Carolina, tells me the same story. His premiums are also tripling from $400 to more than $1,200. Diane, one of my constituents from Clemens, tells me that her health care premiums are slated to rise from $193 per month to $553 per month beginning on January 1, 2014, again due to Obamacare. William from Winston-Salem recently informed me that his son's 2014 renewal rate came in. His premiums are rising from $314 to $821.96. Mr. Speaker, until now we've been forced to debate Obamacare in the abstract, using economic predictions and common sense to explain why this ill-conceived law is going to be, as one of its key proponents in the Senate predicted, a train wreck. But now the verdict is in. Families from across my district are receiving letters from insurers explaining that the so-called Affordable Care Act is driving their premiums sky high. My constituents don't want to be forced to change their health care plans or risk losing access to doctors they trust. Again, they were promised that if they liked their doctor, they could keep their doctor, and if they liked their health care plan, they could keep it. Those promises were broken. These aren't abstractions or predictions. These are real people whose health and livelihoods are being threatened by this law. Mr. Speaker, the proponents of this disastrous scheme keep reminding us that it is, quote, the law of the land, end quote. They implore us to simply give up and move on. We will not give up on our constituents. We will not move on when they need us to seek fairness on their behalf. The other side acts as if this bill, which they hastily cobbled together and passed on a party line vote against massive popular opposition, is so firmly entrenched in American law that it can never be amended or repealed. This is nonsense, and they know it. Obamacare is the law. But what do we do in Congress every day? We work to change bad laws, and we certainly work to make sure laws treat all Americans fairly. And as Rich Lowry recently pointed out, quote, if this were a consistent principle rather than opportunistic advice, Democrats would have been content to leave a number of policies they vigorously fought in place out of deference to duly constituted policy and law, end quote. Mr. Speaker, this is about basic fairness. The President has given special treatment to big business, Congress, and his well-connected political allies. But he refuses to offer the same relief to working families. That's wrong. That's not fair. Ordinary Americans deserve the same exemption that the President has given businesses. Let's reopen this government. Let's reopen it fairly. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman